I'm Ty King, and
there you go.
Start the first RCast, which was last year, because I was being honored by the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, actually. And so it's a title that they give to young entrepreneurs who are trying to give back to the community. We do a lot of volunteerism. And so in return, I had to do some fundraising for them. And so I tried a few different events, the little coffee shop things where people were donating money towards the cause, but it wasn't really making a dent in the amount that I was raising for the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation. So I own a marketing company, but I was like, what's something that's interesting that I could bring to Arkansas that we haven't had yet? And so if any of you know what RTX is, and so my particular type of podcast I listen to are usually gaming news, like video games and comedy, that type of thing. There's a thing called RTX that happens in Austin every year in Texas, and it's a huge event, and I was like, I'm just going to make my own here. And if we make money, great. If we don't, fantastic too, because I had fun. And I tricked everybody into coming in here as a speaker, and I got to learn from them, right? How to do podcasting better. So I don't have a journalism background. Karen does, but I'm more of a podcast enthusiast, I guess you would say, right? Like a lot of you are here, I imagine so, right? You're interested in podcasting. Some of you probably already have a podcast, but you want to learn how to do it better. That's the kind of mode I'm into. I always want to learn from other people who are doing it successfully. Learned a lot from Karen. I've learned a ton from the amount of speakers that we've had. Yeah. So last year, Karen was actually one of my main speakers at RCast. I'd had no idea who she was. She has a true crime podcast called Burden. And it was a pretty gripping story about a crime that happened in Texarkana, and people didn't receive justice off of that. And so she made a whole season about it.
Yeah.
Very interesting. And she had a podcast launch party that was and that was the first I'd seen that in Arkansas too. I was like, who has a launch party for their podcast in Arkansas? So even though the medium has been around for over 25 years, Arkansas is still figuring out its relationship to podcasting itself, right? We don't really know. We have a vague idea of what it is, but it's kind of like when everything switched over to streaming and people were starting to cut the cord on cable. It's just like, okay, I can watch whatever I want to, when I want to, and what do I watch? Nobody told me what to watch, and so can I have some recommendations? And that's just kind of where we're at with podcasting. What are the uses of podcasting? And we'll cover a lot of those today. So yeah. After the first year, there was such an interest in it that we formed a 501c3 nonprofit organization for podcasters in Arkansas. Why a nonprofit, you would say? Well, it's because there is a lot of, to put it simply, there's a lot of grants that come to Arkansas from federal level to the state level. Those grants that are supposed to go towards the arts usually go towards what you think of as art, right? So painters, you think of people that are doing murals or writers. If it's in the audio space, it's always been in music. So nobody has considered podcasting to be an art, right? So it needed a champion in the ring. We were like, well, we'll get on a horse, we'll put on our armor, we'll step into the ring, and we will be the champion for podcasters and give some of that grant money to help them get into studios, get coaching, all the help that they need, equipment, to get started for podcasts so that we can raise it up as an industry in Arkansas. Because if we don't, so all the trends in media usually start from either side of the coast, right? East or west. The middle usually gets left out. Arkansas is always, like I said, this medium has been around for over 25 years. And here we are still trying to figure out what is a podcast. Okay, so we don't want to get left behind because year after year after year, we'll get into it about how much growth has happened in listenership in podcasting. We don't want to get left behind. We want Arkansas and its diverse voices that are here to have a platform to be able to speak and tell their stories, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, like I was saying, this is the first time that we are in Northwest Arkansas. And tomorrow night, so we're having this event tonight, obviously, and tomorrow night is RCast Northwest Arkansas. So you can come out and learn you were talking about learning from professionals. All kinds of Arkansas podcasters will be there. There will be some national guests as well speaking. Someone from the School of Podcasting who knows podcasting inside and out will be there. So please come on out. Tickets are $15, is that right, Ty? Yes. I think they're $15, yeah. And so with the code JOY, JOI, you can get $10 off of general admission. So we hope that we will see you tomorrow night. So who are we? Like I said, we're the Arkansas Podcast Collaborative. And really what we want to do is empower podcasters to succeed. And so what we try to do is give them, anyone interested in podcasting or someone who already has a podcast, give them educational opportunities resources and networking events. And so this RCast is our big annual networking event. We are a 501c3 nonprofit, as Ty was saying, and we have board members that include media professionals and members of the education sector. One of our board members is actually here, Clint Schaff, and he has quite an impressive background. He used to work at the LA Times, so we immediately recruited him to come work with us. So we're glad you're here tonight, Clint. Okay, so this is a presentation about the basics of podcasting, but I'm going to make it really short because we have a really special guest here tonight. His name is Mike Rousseau, and he is from PRX, which is a major podcast distribution company. You might have heard of This American Life or TED Talks Daily or Snap Judgment. He helps distribute those shows, or his company does. So he's going to go into detail on a lot of these things, but I'm just going to do a quick overview. So people often ask, what makes a successful podcast? And what I think the answer to that is three things. Content. You have to have good content. Tech setup. You have to know how to be on all the major podcast distributing apps. And marketing, because you can't just make content. You have to also let people know where to find it. So the basics of finding your content. What you want to think about is, who is your audience? Do I have the credibility or expertise to talk about this subject? Because that's a big thing. If in your podcast opener you can say, hey, you're listening to this, and this is why you should listen to me, and make the case for that, you're going to have a really good podcast. Listeners want to know what sets you apart. And then you also want to narrow your topic. I often ask people, what's your topic, or even who's your audience? And they say, oh, well, everyone. That usually doesn't work. And also your topic, something really broad. You're going to want to really specialize in a given topic. So show format. Most of us are familiar with Q&A format, but there are also other ones. The interview Q&A format, you can have one host asking a guest a question on every episode, or you can have co-hosts, two hosts asking guests questions. There's something called a solo cast, which is just recording an episode. The host records an episode, whenever you drop an episode, and you release it like that. So you don't have to have any guests. I know there was a psychologist who releases every week. She releases an episode, and that was a great way for her to educate people and build her business too. Non-fictional narrative storytelling, that's a lot like journalism, but in audio form. And then fictional podcasts, that's something that people often don't think about, I think, but there are really fun fictional podcasts out there. We have someone in Arkansas, Aaron Wallace, who has, what is his podcast called? It is Tomorrow's a New Day. And so he's breaking into that industry, and he has like voice actors that he uses. And so it's just really cool that we have that here in Arkansas.
I know we're moving kind of fast.
Go for it. Yeah.
I want to talk about how our website has the first database of all the podcasts that are being produced in Arkansas currently. We're continuously, every day, we're getting more submitted to us. And so we're going to get into the marketing part, right? But not everybody markets their podcast. Maybe they're just doing it for fun, or they don't think that their audience is in Arkansas, so they don't see a need of posting it to where everybody else here sees it, right? But one of the things that we found, and I saw that the need was there because when I was looking for speakers last year, I was trying to find a list of where all of the podcasters were in Arkansas, and it just didn't exist. And so we have just slowly, painstakingly tried to put together this list. We have over 250 already as it is. I know there's so many more that we just don't even know about. But so we start collecting all this data, you start seeing trends in certain things too. And you start seeing a lack where other areas are. And so one of the lacks that we have in Arkansas is fictional podcasting. So if anybody's ever listened to Welcome to Night Vale or any of those types of, the podcasts that are scripted, but they're theatrical, right? And so it reminds me a lot of the old the radio plays, right? The Shadow or Twilight Zone, that type of thing. We've only got one that we know of in Arkansas. That's it. Entire state. Over 250 podcasts. We've only got one fictional that's in operation, and most of their voice cast is in Australia and then across the rest of the country. And not a lot of people know about it in Arkansas. It's so strange to me because, you guys know, being here in Fayetteville, college towns, we have so many of them. And we have so many colleges that are teaching creativity and creative writing. And, the fiction's being created. Why are we not using it in podcasting? That's the strangest thing. And so I just wanted to hype on that a little bit.
Yeah, no, you're definitely a fan of fiction podcasting, and that's true. And so we're lacking fiction podcasts here in Arkansas, and what we're also lacking is just a diversity in hosts. And so that's what we hope to change, so everybody can tell their story. So when you're making a podcast, another factor you're going to want to think about is your show length. A common length, the industry standard, tends to be 20 to 30 minutes. But I think the important thing there is don't feel like you have to make it 20 or 30 minutes. Make it fit the content. If you have more, that's great. If you have less, that's totally fine. So ask yourself, what is necessary and what best serves your audience. Show branding. So the things you're going to need to get off the ground are podcast cover art, and that's the little square image that you see in podcasting apps like iTunes and Spotify that represents the podcast. And then you're going to want to think about your intro music and your outro music because, and you don't have to have music, but for the most part, it makes it sound more polished and it makes it more fun to tune into a podcast. Your release schedule is another thing that you're going to want to think about. And these are just all factors that, can be. By the way, does anyone have a podcast here in this audience? Okay. And who wants to start a podcast or is thinking of it? Oh, all right. Awesome. Okay. Well, release schedule is something that you're going to want to think about. You want to be consistent. The nature of podcasting is that an episode drops regularly. And so whether that is once a month, whether that is every week or every, quarter, stay on that schedule and be consistent. That is how you will keep your audience. Your audience is going to start to know you as the podcast that releases podcasts on Tuesday. And so keep that there. And go ahead, Ty.
I was gonna say, there's also an option to do seasonal, just like you would with a television series, right?
Yeah.
So you record 12 episodes and you release those out. You take a break while you're recording, working on your next season, however long that takes. That also works. But as long as it's a cohesive story being told all together, right? There's a beginning and there's an end of this season, and then stay tuned for season 2.
Yeah, as long as people don't think you just dropped off the earth and you're not doing your podcast anymore. So one thing that helps with a release schedule is building a content calendar. And so that will really help. Sometimes it seems overwhelming, but if you can build a content calendar and think this is this episode, this is the next episode, and maybe just, think about the next 4 episodes, that's incredibly helpful. And it is now industry standard to release at least 3 episodes on your launch date. And so a lot of people have 1 episode, they get really excited about it, they're ready to release it. But statistics have shown that that's actually, your audience isn't going to be as loyal as if you let them binge like the first 3 episodes the first time around. And then plan for sick or vacation time. It's easy to say I'm going to have a weekly podcast, but there will always be a time that you go on vacation or you're sick. And so planning for that and having a couple episodes in the can is good. Evergreen shows, if you have a topic that you cover, it's always good to have evergreen shows. If you cover something that's timely, also think about an evergreen show that you can drop in and will be just as relevant today as in 6 months. Another thing to think about is, so if you want to reach out to guests, how do you come across as credible? And something that often impresses people when you ask them to be on your show, it's called a podcast one sheet to give to your guests. And so it has who you are, the host, what your topic is of your show, anything the guest should know. And usually common questions are, well, how long is this interview going to take? That's a big one, so let them know. And then once you get show statistics, and if they are impressive, let them know what kind of audience your podcast goes out to. So we talked about the tech setup. And the first thing you're going to want to do is find a hosting service for your podcast. It's a little confusing, but often people think that they have to release a podcast episode and go into iTunes and do it in Spotify and download that file or upload that file to a million different places. But really, what you'll need to do is you'll get a hosting service, and you'll do that just once. You will basically get, so if you upload your first file, you'll get what's called an RSS feed. And you can then submit that to iTunes, Spotify, Google, and other podcasting apps. So it's really taking the initiative once to set up with an account. And then from there, your RSS feed will automatically notify Apple and Spotify. And when you publish a new episode in your hosting service, it's going to distribute to all of the various places.
Your RSS feed stands for Real Simple Syndication. It just it's a piece of code that gets generated for you, and you post it in the different places where you want it to go. Like if it's Google, if it's Apple, wherever you want your podcast to go, each episode after that, you only have to do it once. Like she said, you set it up once. And the way I've been explaining it to people is like in layman's terms, right? Because you're the professional one, I'm not. I like to think of it as when you go to Libsyn or Buzzsprout or Acast, wherever you're hosting your website, every time you drop an episode, it's like taking it to Grand Central Station, and then the trains take it out to Chicago, Baltimore, and then, LA. And so it's taking it to all those other podcasting platforms on its own, but you have to deliver it the one time. The trains do the rest of it, and that's RSS feeds.
Yeah. So do you have a question, sir?
I'm guessing they charge for a monthly fee.
There are some free ones out there. Acast is free. Buzzsprout and Libsyn, I don't think, have free versions anymore. But there are free. Of course, you're going to get on one of those and probably be tempted to upgrade to another plan. But I know I use Acast for the podcasts that I have, and I've been really happy with just the basic features that they offer in a free plan.
We also use Spotify for podcasters.
Yeah.
And so that one is also free to use. And it's, of course, very friendly with Spotify, but it also delivers to Apple. It also delivers to Google and everywhere else that you could think of. But that's been completely free. It's just some things to think about is like, how do you monetize your podcast in the future if you ever want to make money off of it? Spotify for podcasters is a little harder to get into that arena as far as like getting the ads through how would you say it? So the ads where you sign up, you have to have a certain amount of downloads per month. So the requirements, the hurdles are higher with Spotify.
Right. Yeah.
With Acast, it's not.
There's actually no hurdle. So Spotify says you have to have, X number of listeners before we're even going to consider your show for ads. Acast actually doesn't do that. They, so you can have 10 listeners and they will still consider it. That said, someone has to buy those ads, so they might not be as interested, but Acast does not have that threshold. So I think it's a good one to start with. So podcasts need websites because it's really important that when people Google your podcast or they Google keywords, that they can get to it. And so there are services like Podpage that you can subscribe to that make a website. You just give your RSS feed and it makes a beautiful website. So you can do that. Or if you know how to do it yourself, consider doing that. But on your website, it's really helpful if you have easy links to all podcast apps. So you have one website users can click into, whether it's, Apple, Spotify, Google, and get there easily. Easy links to all of your social media. And then SEO friendly. Now that has a lot to do with transcripts. And so and there's a lot of like automated services where you can upload an audio file these days and get a transcript of it. And it is very, very helpful. If you upload that transcript, it's actual text that lives on the internet, and it'll help people get to your website and discover your podcast. And also what's nice with the website is you can just say, go to, my website. And then at the end of your show, you don't have to say, we're on Apple, Spotify, Twitter, and find us here. And these are our handles on social media. It gets a little bit messy. So it's really nice to just say, go to our website and do it that way. And then services like Podpage have fun things like voicemail features where you can ask listeners to leave a voicemail so your show can be more interactive. Email sign up, having a newsletter for your podcast is really, really helpful. And a contact form. Obviously, that's really basic, but you want to make it very clear how people can contact you. Your gear. People often ask, how am I going to record this? And there are two types of recording. There's remote recording, which a lot of people use now. It's like Zoom. And so oftentimes we are not in the same room. We're not able to be in the same room as our guests. And so you're going to use a remote recording service. And Zoom is great, the Zoom that we all know from the pandemic, but there are also companies that specialize in podcast recording. And some of those are Squadcast, Zencaster, Riverside, and then StreamYard. And then there's also in-person recording. And the piece of equipment that I would personally recommend, I'm not paid by them whatsoever, but Zoom, which is different from Zoom remote recording. This is getting really confusing. Zoom is an audio, manufacturing company. They have the H4n Pro and the PodTrack P4. And those are, I think, really simple to use, very user-friendly, especially the Zoom H4n Pro. And so that would be my recommendation. We also, I will segue into a sponsor that we have, Bedford Camera. They are outside, and so they have some equipment that they would love to show you. So if you have any questions about equipment, you want to try something out, you want to see what they have, feel free to visit the table. And then a couple more things. When you choose your gear or your microphone, you're going to want a dynamic microphone and not a condenser. That's just one of those things that will make your life a lot easier. And then you can consider a USB mic, so something you can plug in right into your computer, and it will record into your computer. And then headphones, I honestly just use earbuds most of the time, but there are some really nice ones made by, Sony, Audio-Technica, etc., that you can consider. So monetization. How do I make money from your podcast? That's really hard to do in the first couple years, especially, but there are some things to keep in mind for the future. There's always the subscription model, and people can pay for bonus episodes. There's something called Patreon, where you can put extra content on there and people can subscribe. There's dynamic ad insertion, which is what Ty was talking about, where you're uploading your episodes and there is basically a way for people to buy ads on your podcast. And how that works is you mark, so there are 3 types of ads that can be run. There's the pre-roll, which starts the podcast. There's the mid-roll, which is in the middle, and you mark that point. And then there's the end roll, which is at the end. So that is something to look into. Acast, Spotify for podcasters, and other services, and Buzzsprout too, have found ways to easily get ads into your podcast. If you have enough listeners, some not. And then seek out local and national sponsors is always a really good way, something to think about in terms of monetizing, and whether that's in trade. For example, the launch party that I did. So season 1 of my podcast Burden focused on domestic violence. And so I partnered with a remote working space for women. It's called The Nest in Little Rock. And so it focuses on women in the workplace and supporting each other. And so I found that venue, and then I ran, ads and thanked The Nest on Burden. And so we were able to have a launch party that was paid for, because I definitely didn't have the budget to pay their $500 fee or whatever. Do you have something you want to say?
Yeah, for sure. So one of the main things that we get asked about is, people have an idea for a podcast, right? And you want to figure out how to write out the episodes, how to record. But then it gets down to, how do I make money off of this? And so with podcasting, like she says, it's very hard, if ever, to make money off of your podcast within the first couple of years. And so what I would ask you to do is really think about what would be a good benefit for you to earn from podcasting, right? So you've heard the marketing term ROI, so your return on investment, right? So podcasting has a very different ROI. It's return of influence, right? So you're using this as a platform to grow yourself, either as your character or your business. So a dentist could have a podcast and maybe they don't have any sponsors whatsoever. They're just putting a podcast out there to give some good information out to the public. Hey, here are some good tips about keeping your teeth clean and avoid cavities, right? Somebody heard that. They go to that dentist's office because they trust them now because they heard that message. And like, well, you sounded like a good dentist, and so I can do. They just made a return, right? They didn't need sponsorship to make money off of the podcast. The podcast paid for itself by bringing in new clients, right? You can have a shop on Etsy and you have a podcast about whatever it is some yarn dolls or whatever it is that so there's an audience out there for it, right? So you're directing those people to your shop. They're buying there. You are making a return on that. You don't need to have, there's a lot of them that have it. It's great. It's great to have when money's just pouring in. You don't really have to do anything after the episode is out there, but there are plenty of different ways to make a podcast work for you. It's just content, right? And it works better than social media. If anybody's ever made a craft or you tried to sell anything online and you go and you make a post on Instagram or Facebook and then you don't get any traction off of it, it's really frustrating, right? Podcasting is a much easier way to do that because there is an audience for every subject. I don't care if you're talking about miniature Shetland ponies, right? There may be 13 people in the world that are out there, but that's an audience that's already built in. And so people worry about, I don't have an audience, and people's not going to want to listen to me. Karen and I can have the same script in front of us, read the exact same information. Somebody's going to prefer me over her, and somebody's going to prefer her over me just because of the way that we talk, or maybe it's the pacing or whatever it is, or maybe it doesn't matter. Somebody's going to prefer you over the other podcasts, and you have an audience there. It's just getting over that hurdle of yourself and thinking, oh, I can't do this because I'm not a professional, right? Nobody is a professional when they start. That's just the truth.
Yeah, absolutely. So podcasting, while you might not make money immediately, it's really cool because where else do you have kind of the authority to call anybody up and say hey, will you be on my podcast? So you can it's an excellent networking tool. And then merch, of course. People love merch. So podcasting ads, one really neat thing is that if you have podcast or ads running on your podcast, they are one of the fastest growing channels in digital media. If you think about, you're clicking through a website and all these banner ads pop up, and you're not interested in them, or you've moved on to something else 5 seconds, later because something else popped up. People don't usually consume ads or have the attention span, but if it's in a podcast, most people don't fast forward through it. They listen to it, and especially if their host read, that's important to them, and they will listen to that. So there's a big podcast ad market coming, it's already here. So that's something to think about. So marketing your podcast, this is the key because you don't want to create content that ultimately no one's going to find. Like we talked about, you want to submit to all directories. Don't just, or I would recommend don't just do Apple, don't just do Spotify. There are 14, major ones. So submit it to all of those because you won't automatically get on those. That's important, I think, to say. Some people think that they will do their podcasts and Apple and Spotify will pick it up. And no, that is definitely not always the case. And then the big thing about podcasting is find your podcast friend. Because, sometimes it's hard. There's a website I recommend called raphonic.com/graph. And it is really great to find your podcast buddies. It will show people who have listened or people who listen to your podcast also listen to this. And so if you're struggling to gain an audience, connect with those and reach out to the hosts of those podcasts and see if you can do something like an ad swap where they promote your podcast on their podcast and vice versa. And then promotion YouTube. It's really important to know that how important YouTube is now. It's the number one way people find out about podcasts. Even if YouTube is intimidating and you don't want anything to do with video recording or uploading to YouTube, you can upload your audio. There are services like Headliner and others where you can upload audio and it automatically makes a video out of it. So you have a still image. It can be your episode artwork or whatever that is now in a video, and you can upload it to YouTube. And in your show, in your podcast, always prompt listeners to subscribe, share, and review. You can send a press release when your podcast launches. And of course, you can have a launch party. But most importantly, so why be a guest? If someone asks you to be a guest on their podcast, remember that it's just a really powerful marketing and networking tool. And you can borrow audience from other podcasts. If you go on someone else's podcast and their podcast is a little more successful, has more listeners, they're going to hear you. They're going to hear you say what your podcast is, and they're likely going to come over to your podcast. So make podcast buddies is what I always say.
Yeah, I was going to say, it works both ways that way too, because if you have a show and you're inviting people onto yours, you're still gonna what you're getting into, which is borrowing their audience. And it also gives you access to amount of knowledge that you maybe you wouldn't normally have access to, right? So we spoke at the University of, where we go? It was the Arkansas. Gosh, the acronyms in this state, right?
Yeah.
Arkansas Association.
The workforce
of
one.
Colleges and something. I don't know. Employment. Yeah. Anyways, it was a mile long. You know what I mean? But we went there. They wanted to learn how can we use podcasting in finding a job. And so we were talking about using this as either part of your resume, but also as a job building tool to where if you say you want to get into a very specific type of industry or a skill set, and maybe your college degree is not really getting you there. Imagine that. But you have to ask somebody that's already in that field. And you're like, I really want to get that person in the room just to ask them some serious questions. Start your podcast, invite them on the show. People are so flattered to be invited on a podcast. It's like, me? Okay. All right. Yeah. All right. I'll be on your podcast. And then they tell everybody. Now you got free marketing, the best guest, and you're learning directly one-on-one with the person that you wanted to be in the room with. And plus now it opens up your network. You get a few of those in your pocket. Now you know several people that's already in the industry. Now you've got a recorded file that you can actually show to anybody that you want to be employed by in that industry. I mean, it's an all-around win.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. And a podcast episode doesn't just have to be a podcast episode. The content repurposing is really important. It can, you can take something, a snippet of your podcast, and put it on social media. You can write a blog post based on your podcast. And so the more ways that you can, because people consume content all kinds of ways. You know, some people might not want to listen to a podcast, but they do like blogs. So make it into a blog post or make it into a post on social media. So don't just think that this is one episode and I can't do anything else with it. There are many, many things that you can do with it. And then being a guest also has SEO benefits. So when you're a guest, someone's going to say, and my guest on this podcast was, and your bio is going to be there and likely a link to your podcast. And so that really helps people discover your podcast. So if you can be a guest on a podcast, I would definitely recommend it because it's a great way to grow your show. So next we have a special guest here tonight. He is with PRX, Microso, and PRX is a podcast distribution company. Like I was saying, This American Life is one podcast, TED Talks Daily, Radiotopia. And so they really help distribute podcasts, help people learn about podcasts. And so we are thrilled to have Microso, who is the senior content strategist, is that right? Who helps basically people, who want to know where's my content coming from, give me some ideas. Mike helps with this. And so thank you for traveling here from Kansas City. And Mike is going to, basically the overview that we just gave, Mike is going to give some more details on those things. So